Thanks again for joining. We are the Guidance and Child Study Center. As I mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Cecilia Lopez, as well as Louise Dutra. And the Guidance and Child Study Center, we exist to improve school and life outcomes of kids and students who are the most vulnerable and kids who are marginalized. And I think that, this is so critical at this time as we think about just the context that we're all in, of the health struggles, of the mental health challenges that we're experiencing, economic challenges, and I just appreciate all of you and all the work that you are doing and for being here at this time. All the resources will be made available going forward. So I mentioned that within a few days, this will be posted to YouTube and you can share the video. And in addition, the PowerPoint and all the embedded resources will also be available as well. The best way to obtain these resources is to put your email in the chat box to Louise Dutra. Her email is ldutra, D-U-T-R-A, sorry, actually, you don't need to put her email in there because you would just be chatting to her. So you can just put your email in the chat to Louise and she will send you the PowerPoint at the end of our meeting today. If you'd like to connect with us going forward, we can also add you to our mailing list for upcoming events, and we're also on Twitter, and you can see our Twitter handles there. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with some welcomes and a couple of disclaimers. A big thank you for everyone who's here and a couple groups in particular. We're also going to start with self-care and some important reminders about our own self-care during this time. And then we will get into Trauma 101, with the idea being that today we want to learn about different types of traumatic experiences and their prevalence, and understand how exposure to trauma can impact emotional, social, and academic functioning. You'll see that today's presentation is about trauma on a large scale and not only within COVID-19. Because we believe that in order to respond to any type of trauma, we really need to know the background behind it. And then we'll end with some brief next steps. And here, as I mentioned, is the email, in case you don't get a chance to put your email in the chat. Louise Dutra's email is listed here. Okay, so I'm just going to ask once again if you could please mute while you're on the call. Thank you. So today is the first day of our Enhancing Trauma Responsive Schools during COVID-19 series. And I just want to kind of give the context for some other offerings that are happening this month. Today is part one of this series, where we're going to be discussing Trauma 101, the impact on students and on all. Then on Thursday at the same time, 2 o'clock, we'll have part two of this series on skills and strategies, that we can learn strategies for actually supporting students who have experienced trauma. And then next week on Thursday the 14th, we'll talk about aligning trauma responsive practices within our MTSS, so a multi-tier system of supports. So we have an existing tiered framework. Here's some things that we can look at to systematically align these within our existing framework. And this is all part of our Enhancing Trauma Responsive Schools series, which is designed for everyone in the school. It's for teachers, it's for school administrators, clinicians. We really want this to be accessible to everyone in the school setting. The second part of the series, the second arc here, is the Enhancing Trauma Responsive Schools for School Leaders. And you'll see this below on the bottom left. This is intended for school administrators, for school leaders, and anyone in a leadership role around trauma and school mental health. And this will start on May 19th, and we'll start with trauma and first steps. So what are some things that we can be doing right now as school leaders to support our staff and our school community? And the second part of that will be on trauma and looking ahead. So a deeper look into the impact of trauma and how we can prepare for reentry. And the third part of this arc, Dr. Cecilia Lopez leads, is our School Clinicians Forum. And this is an ongoing weekly forum during the month of May for school mental health clinicians to discuss all the topics that are contained within the series, as well as share best practices, successes, and challenges. And you can see the schedule that is there for the School Clinicians Forum, as well as our School Clinicians Forum and virtual end-of-year celebration on May 18th. Again, all this information will be in the PowerPoint, which we're happy to share with everyone, as well as for you to share with your colleagues going forward. So it's really important to start with some thank yous. And this is Teacher Appreciation Week. And want to thank all the teachers for all that you do to support our students all the time. And in particular, just during this unprecedented time. I think this is week 8 for us as PNW BOCES in terms of working from home. It could be longer depending on where you are, but the work of our teachers is just so incredible. And I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for everything that you do for your students. And I want to give just a huge shout out and appreciation and thanks to all of our teachers and educators during this week. I also want to acknowledge that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And that I think aligned with our Mental Health Association of New York State, who is a very close partner of ours, that we want to work together in May. And that's kind of the goal for this Mental Health Awareness Month, is really working together. And I can't think of a better time to start in working together, as we are all supporting kids. We're all working together at home or remotely or wherever we are, but we're all in this together, and that we want to ensure that our loved ones, friends, networks, and communities are all comfortable talking about the topic of mental health all the time. And through everything that we do, PNW BOCES, through our workshops, we hope that this is a step forward that can help you in talking about the topic of mental health and acknowledging the importance of mental health in all of our lives. And then there's another big thank you, which is for all the support that we receive and the partners who are making these resources available to us. You will see as we start the presentation today that the content is entirely borrowed. It is borrowed from organizations that are publicly funded, that make their resources available so that people like us can access them in technical assistance and in trainings, and to put them to work in schools. So in particular, I want to thank and acknowledge the Treatment and Services Adoption Center, the TSA, for making their content available, as well as the Technology Transfer Center. These are all funded by SAMHSA. And this is also just a asking of forgiveness, because we're sharing a lot of resources. I hope that it's okay. And you can send me a cease and desist if needed, but this is all to benefit kids during this time. So thank you. So before we get into our specific trauma topic, I also want to take some time to acknowledge the importance of self-care. All of us are wearing so many different hats during this time and have so many different roles. We are probably caretakers and providers for family members, for students, for youth, for people in our community. And we need to be well in order to be our best selves, so that we can help others who we are looking to help. So when we think about self-care, there's a way to frame it in terms of our ABCs of wellness. We think about our awareness, balance, and connection. And I want to quickly just highlight these things and just take a moment to see if there's something that we can do to be aware of our emotions, how we're feeling right now. It's okay to have a range of emotions. I think in my normal course of the day, there's a broad continuum of times when I cry, or times when I want to cry, or think about it. There's also great times of joy, of accomplishment, and being aware of our emotions, acknowledging them, is a big part of our own wellness. The B is for balance, which is so important also right now, especially in virtual time when we're working from home. Things might carry over. We used to have maybe a commute or something like that, but now everything that we're doing is happening in the same place, and the home is probably taking on a lot of different roles. So it's important to try to maintain balance between our work, our personal lives, some time alone, whatever we need in terms of exercise, physical well-being, emotional well-being, but to ensure that we have some sort of a routine that can help us to stay balanced during this time. And then finally, connections. Connections are a critical part of our well-being with family and friends, as well as with work colleagues. we need to acknowledge that, for all of us, there's probably been a serious disruption in our social connections and our family connections. And, are there ways that we can still be connected even though we may not be together physically? So I'm thinking right now that Mother's Day is coming up, and that's a time when I really want to be with my family and my mom. So are there ways that we can be together either through social distancing or through virtual formats, but also to acknowledge that there are lots of people who may not be able to connect with loved ones. They might have lost loved ones to COVID-19 during this time. So being aware of that, being intentional about our awareness, balance, connection are critically important. And I want each of you to feel good in taking the time to support your own self-care and to take care of yourself, because it's critically important. You deserve it. And we'll be much better off in helping everyone else if we are well ourselves. So I also want to pull a few quotes from Governor Cuomo. These are all from recent press conferences that Governor Cuomo gives, but I feel like they are related to self-care, and they stick with me a lot, and I find myself going back to them, so I wanted to share 4 of them today. The first one he shared, and I remember seeing it on Friday. I don't watch the press conferences every day, but I did watch the one on Friday where we knew that the announcement about the closure of schools was coming. And at some point during that, he shared, remember where we were and what we've accomplished. And that really stuck out with me. I think that there's so much unknown and there's so much that we can't control, but that it's really important to remember where we were. I know for me, the last day in the office was March 13th, and we didn't know what was coming next. And we're 8 weeks into this, and I want to acknowledge what we've accomplished, that we're able to lead these trainings in a way that we never thought we would be able to before. Something that we hadn't thought about in terms of supporting kids virtually. So for yourselves, I hope that you can also do this and to take some time, maybe after the call, to remember where we were and also remember what you've accomplished, and to acknowledge that and to feel good about that. And these accomplishments, they don't need to be so grand. Waking up every morning is an accomplishment. Putting one foot in front of the other is an accomplishment. It's just, I think, part of our self-care to acknowledge our accomplishments as we proceed. The second line is, I don't know. And I really appreciate that Governor Cuomo models this for us by saying things like, I don't know. We don't have all the answers. I don't think we've ever done this before. COVID-19 is new and no one has practiced for this, or we might have prepared as best as we can, but I think that it's okay to say, I don't know, and to acknowledge that we're doing the best that we can and that we're going to work together to get an answer and to figure out what we're going to do. But again, it's about that permission to say, I don't know, and that's okay. Third thing is to wear a mask, and wear a mask when we're in public. And this reminds me of a few things. One, which is that it's something that we can control. We can spread good messages like that we care about others, and we care about the first responders, and we care about those who are older in our communities. And one way to do that is by wearing a mask and stopping the spread. I think that reclaims some of our ownership. It also helps to stop the spread of the disease, and it's something that we can all do. So wear a mask. And the last one is love. I think it's really important that Governor Cuomo has mentioned love throughout all those press conferences. It's something that we can all do. We can love ourselves, we can love each other, and just to lead with the compassion that we trust that we're all trying our best, that we're all doing our best, and that we're going to support each other no matter what. Next thing is I want to share a few of the helplines that are available for us. The New York State Office of Mental Health has our emotional support helpline, which is open to all, and I believe in multiple languages. And the emotional support helpline provides free and confidential support so that this is staffed by volunteers and mental health professionals who are volunteering. And if you need any support to not hesitate to call this line. Similarly, if you or anyone that you know is feeling suicidal or experiencing suicidal thoughts, or to always make the call or reach out to help, because it is there. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is available on the website. There are also options for texting, and this is available in English and in Spanish. And if you or anyone, it's always okay to call. Always make the call, connect. There's help that's there, and there's someone there to help you. And one thing I want to do by sharing these resources with you is hope that you can share them with someone else as well. So whether it's a family member, a colleague from school, that the resources in here you can take forward. And I think these are some of the things that even today we can start to do. Okay, so since we're going to be talking about trauma responsive school systems, I want to start with a 4-step framework for realizing trauma, recognizing it, responding, and then resisting re-traumatization. And this is a framework that is put forth by the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center, the Adaptation Center, which I mentioned earlier. And this is sort of a 4-step approach that we'll follow throughout the series. So we'll start with realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma, and then recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. In our next meeting on Thursday, looking into responding. So what are some of the trauma-informed principles that we can implement to create a safe and nurturing school climate? And then moving forward and implementing the school-wide into all of our systems, how can we resist any of the re-traumatization that may have occurred? And again, the parts that we'll be touching on today are these first two of realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma and recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. So what is childhood trauma? So we have a shared definition, which is that trauma arises from an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms individuals' coping mechanisms, and that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and just say that, I think I mentioned this earlier, we are talking about trauma in the time of COVID-19. However, I want to also acknowledge that we need to have a broader context of where this all fits in. So as we go through this, these definitions existed well before COVID-19, and they will be thereafter. So you can think about all the students or staff who might have experienced trauma, but also think about, particular to this time, who else might be experiencing this. So who else right now of our kids might have an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms our coping mechanisms? Who else is witnessing a physically, emotionally harmful or life-threatening event? And it's pretty obvious that the answers are, which is that I would say everyone in some capacity is experiencing a trauma as it relates to COVID-19. So I'm not going to read through all these definitions. Some of them were captured in the previous slide, but one thing I want to do is also provide you with notes going forward, so that if this is something that you're looking to sort of bring back to others in your school, that you have various formats to do that. So feel free to use these slides as long as you attribute them, as I hope that I've done here, to give credit and to cite appropriately. And these are intended just to help you going forward. So the question of what is a trauma-informed system, you could also say what is a trauma-informed school, but I want to be particular about calling it a system because right now I think that opens us up to more than just the school building itself. So we can think about our community, what is a trauma-informed community. We can think about what is a trauma-informed home, or an agency or an organization. But the idea is that these are attributes of a trauma-informed system, which is that we have a shift in our philosophical position from viewing people as sick or bad to a system that honors and adapts to the experiences of the people that it serves. That's a big piece of what this trauma-informed trauma response is, which is that it's a shift from viewing people as sick or bad to one that honors and adapts to the experiences of the people that it serves. And when we think about what some of these core values are and what you would see if we have this philosophical position, you would see that our trauma-informed system prioritizes these core values. So we lead and we value equity, inclusion, cultural responsiveness, and also cultural humility. That we value safety, we value trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And as we look at these core values, I think, if you want to sort of check in on any one of these with your classroom, with your school, with your home, and say, what are things that we do in our own system to actualize equity, to be inclusive, to respond to our students' culture, to have cultural humility ourselves. Similarly, what do we do to ensure physical, psychological, and emotional safety, to ensure and promote trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment? And we will drill down further, in our upcoming sessions, but I think these core values are a great place to start so that we can start to see what are some things that we can do in the immediate to help promote our own trauma-informed system. On the bottom right here, you'll see sort of one way in which we can realize this philosophical shift, which is that it's like taking the question of what's wrong with you and shifting to asking what has happened to you. So the first part of asking what's wrong with you, that has a viewpoint of a deficit mindset. We are viewing the person as sick or bad, or there's something wrong with them, and we're trying to respond to that. However, if we shift to what has happened to you, then we can view someone as a person, we can adapt to their experiences, and we can respond accordingly, especially when it comes to trauma. So now we're going to look at 4 different types of events that may cause traumatic stress. And these are different types of exposures to trauma: acute exposure, chronic exposure, complex exposure, and intergenerational exposure. So starting with acute exposure, this is a trauma that is related to events that are limited in terms of the duration, so the time, and that are typically a one-time occurrence. So you see here someone who has suffered a terrible car accident. That is an acute exposure. It is a one-time event. The trauma is related and attributed to that car accident itself, which hopefully is a one-time occurrence. The second type of exposure is chronic exposure. And this is trauma related to events that occur repeatedly over time. So you can see, you can think about a child who lives in a home where there could be arguments, domestic violence, substance abuse, things that are chronically happening over time. Neglect is another one. So complex exposure. So this is early onset trauma that occurs on many levels over time within the caregiving system, such as a situation in which a child consistently experiences neglect, physical abuse, and other events of an often invasive or interpersonal nature. And the last one is intergenerational exposure or historical exposure, which is trauma related to cumulative physical, psychological, and social wounding over the lifespan and across generations. And this resulting from massive traumatic events experienced as a group. So examples of this trauma that are on a large scale are things like the Holocaust, slavery, and it can also be experienced within smaller communities or families, such as refugee communities and immigrant families. And for each of these, as we think about the various traumas that our students have, again, these are all happening before COVID-19. So this is the background, this is the context. We can think about what happens with COVID-19, what might our students be experiencing during this time, and what's going to be the impact of that going forward. So we also know that there are specific groups who are more vulnerable to higher rates of childhood adversity and to trauma exposure. And this is certainly not limited, but we want to acknowledge that children from under-resourced communities, children in poverty, children who have parents or who are living in homes where there's alcohol or drug dependency, our LGBTQ youth, also immigrant and refugee students with and without legal status, and students with disabilities. And again, this is sort of baseline, excuse me, baseline knowledge that we know about trauma in general. And when we compound this with COVID-19, we can see the extension of how groups who are the most vulnerable, everything amplifies when there's even more trauma. So trauma hits them the worst. It's usually exponential. We know, we've seen even in New York State how COVID-19 is impacting people of color, people who are poor, much harder than the rest. We know that alcohol and drug use is up in homes, as well as domestic violence. For LGBTQ youth, who are the group of young people who have the highest suicide rate, we know that there are disruptions in their school life that might be hitting them harder than other groups. And similarly for immigrant and refugee students, having access and, combined with people of color who are being impacted by this in disproportionate ways, how just this trauma can compound, and how we need to be so aware of this that we can respond accordingly. For students with disabilities, the virtual learning platforms and the regression that we can sort of expect with students, I think would be even greater for students with disabilities, especially students with disabilities who need really specialized instruction or access to particular things that might be difficult to replicate through virtual formats. So I'm not going to go through each of the communities. I touched on them briefly, but we know about the challenges of students from under-resourced communities and students in poverty. I mentioned children in homes, parents or in homes with substance abuse, dependency, LGBTQ youth, immigrant and refugee students, and students with disabilities. And I just want to say that one of the reasons why I'm going quickly through these is not to skip over any of these. We actually have had specific webinars on students who are immigrants and refugees and students who are LGBTQ. So we're happy to share those resources. And we have full webinars on supporting these students that we're happy to share with you. So how do we know what we know about trauma and its impact on kids? Well, most of this information on a large scale goes back to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs, which was a large-scale study done in California of more than 17,000 people to study the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences as well as the impact. And we're going to spend some time just to look at the data on things that we learned from the ACEs study. Some of the indicators that were explored during the ACEs study were neglect, household challenges, and abuse. So emotional and physical neglect, domestic abuse, parental drug abuse, parental mental illness, divorce or separation, physical abuse or sexual abuse. And people were asked through surveys to, what was the prevalence of these in your life growing up, either as a child or even to ask adults, what were the prevalence of these things during your childhood, so that they could study both the prevalence and the impact of these experiences. So some key findings here, and you can see again, there were more than 17,000 people who were part of this study, but this was completed by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in California. And we learned that more than 25% grew up in a household with a parent that abused drugs. So 1 in 4. We learned that 20% or 1 in 5 had a parent with mental illness. And that 25% or 1 in 4 had experienced physical abuse. And that's just one of these indicators. Also learned that 1 in 6 had 4 or more ACEs. So again, thinking about the trauma that people have experienced in terms of the prevalence, in this one study, learning that 1 in 6 people had 4 or more ACEs. And if you look at these indicators and you think about your own students, the makeup of your class, you can think about, how might they respond to these? Have they experienced emotional abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse? What are the various household challenges in their house? What's happening there? And we can start to paint the picture of what does trauma look like among our students currently? And again, when we think about the impact of COVID-19, who else would be impacted by this? So this is a video that that is embedded into the presentation, so I hope you can take a few minutes to watch it, but it's just more on adversity in your environment and what we learned from the ACEs study. So continuing to realize the prevalence and impact of trauma. This is the prevalence, and now we're moving into the impact. So what does all this mean for kids in terms of learning, in terms of their social and emotional well-being? That's sort of the next step here. So Paul Tough, in the great book, Helping Children Succeed, What Works and Why, laid out sort of a lot of the impacts of this trauma on kids, particularly with learning. And he said that over the past decade, neuroscientists have determined how severe and chronic stress in childhood leads to physiological and neurological adaptations in children that affect the way their minds and bodies develop and the way they function in school. So again, this is saying that severe and chronic stress in childhood actually impacts us physiologically and neurologically, meaning it impacts our brain. And if you think about changing our brain, then that's absolutely going to impact the way our bodies develop and certainly the way that students function in school. So this is a diagram that shows what's happening in a typically functioning brain. So we'll start on the left-hand side here, which is that something scary happens. We have a scary event. Then our brain, particularly in our amygdala, produces an alarm signal, and it overrides thinking in the brain. And what do? We respond to it through our fight, flight, and freeze. And this is good. This is helpful. This is what we want. The changes brought about in the brain as stress reaction are helpful in our immediate phase of actual danger. It is good to know when something dangerous is happening. It means our brain is working, and it tells us to do something right away. What we don't want and what we know can occur is that there can be a trauma reminder. So something that reminds us of that scary event, which may or may not to be sort of layperson even seem like an actual reminder of that event. And that could set off a false alarm, where again, our amygdala produces these alarm signals and it overrides our thinking and our brain, and we respond as if this were the actual crisis. So our fight, flight, freeze, that's all going on, but this occurred due to a false alarm. So the changes brought about in the brain at the stress reaction are actually not helpful because the amygdala produced this false alarm. Again, we're not going to watch this video, but it's included in here so that you can see just how relentless stressors on the brain can be. And what we're going to do instead is actually take a look at both a healthy brain as well as an abused brain so that we can see the effects of chronic stress. So on the left-hand side is the healthy brain, and on the right-hand side is the abused brain. And I know very little about the brain, but what I do know from a little bit is that the temporal lobes, which are the part that are circled, that regulates emotions, and they receive input from our senses. So these circles are our temporal lobes, and they're very important for regulating our emotions. So on the left-hand side, we have this healthy brain, and this is a normal child. So you can see regions of high activity. High activity is the red or orange. Low activity is in black. So we see high activity and low activity in the temporal lobes. And then on the right-hand side, this is a PET scan of the brain of a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized shortly after birth. And this shows the extreme deprivation in infancy. So the temporal lobes were on the left-hand side. You saw high activity. You can actually see those physiological and neurological differences that we were referring to. So there's very little activity in these temporal lobes. They say that these regulate emotions, they receive input from the senses, and you can see here, they are nearly quiescent, so there's not much activity here around the emotional and cognitive pieces, and that these can cause problems in kids. So how do we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma? So the first thing, and I'm sure in some capacity you might have seen this iceberg figure before, but we can think about this as, there's what we see with our eyes, which if we think about the iceberg, might even look like a lot, but we know that actually below the iceberg, there is so much more happening. And when we think about being trauma informed, what we can include in this underwater part of this iceberg are things like psychological stress, your individual personality, the culture. So talking about youth culture and everything that kids experience, our community environment, family influences. So there's what we see and is observable, and that is really just the tip of the iceberg, because all these other things are happening under the surface. So there's 4 types of trauma symptoms. They are cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and physical. So some of the common cognitive symptoms that you might see are things around on concentration and organizationally. So students might have difficulty paying attention in class, incomplete classroom and homework assignments. Those are things that are attributed to concentration. Organizationally, difficulty with time management and difficulty following instructions. Also, memory can be impacted. When you think about the physiological and neurological things that we saw in the brain, memory can be included in this. So difficulty recalling previously learned information, difficulty memorizing facts and lists, and or difficulty finding words. And distortions, so extreme or exaggerated thoughts. So saying things like, I can't handle the situation, or no one cares about me, or feeling like I'm a bad person, I'm powerless, or life is meaningless. These are things that you might hear from students that would signal that there is trauma, again, that's underneath the surface. So moving from the cognitive symptoms to the emotional ones, some of the emotional symptoms of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. We're not going too far into this, and one of the reasons is that the purpose of this training is also for all school staff. So with a lot of these, we are not intended to be someone who diagnoses. We want to be able to know what symptoms are so we can get students more help. And just knowing some of these symptoms are important, but this is not to say that we are to take on the role of diagnosing someone with PTSD or with anxiety or with any other mental health challenge. But here are some of the symptoms you might see if someone has anxiety, which are excessive worry about a variety of things, including school, the health or safety of other family members, continuously having doubt, being restless, sense of dread or fear of the future. It can also manifest physically in the form of stomach aches or headaches, particularly in younger students. And for post-traumatic stress disorder, you might see students experiencing intrusive or distressing thoughts, avoiding people, places, or things that might remind them of that traumatic experience. Remember when we think back to the equation where something scary happens, and then it triggers our amygdala, and then we have our response. Avoiding certain people, places, or things that might remind us of them are one way to avoid that scary thing. So you might see someone being jumpy or agitated, and also reenacting part of that traumatic experience in their play. This is common, particularly in younger students. So are they acting out things that might look like or play back part of that actual trauma? And then certainly around feeling depressed, you can see feelings of hopelessness, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, fatigue, agitation and irritability, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, and difficulty with motivation. Common behavioral symptoms. These are sort of grouped into two different areas, one of acting out and one which is shutting down. So in terms of acting out, you might see a student who's overreacting to seemingly typical circumstances, being jumpy when alarms go off or doors slam, also aggression. And then the shutting, maybe not engaging with family or friends as they have previously done, withdrawing from typical routine, including activities such as sports or clubs, and it also include changes in interests. And then this can manifest physically as well. So fatigue or frequent tiredness, headaches, stomach aches, again, especially in younger kids, development or worsening of medical conditions such as digestive problems, chronic pain, or chronic illnesses. And then this diagram shows the impact on cognitive functioning and all the different things that, because of the physiological and neurological impact on our brain, some things that could be really difficult for students who have experienced trauma. Things like you mentioned concentrating and focus, sitting still, processing oral information, talking, especially when experiencing a stress reaction, remembering things, that's the memory component, contextualizing, organizing, and setting goals. So we're not going to get into the skills and strategies today, but as educators and as school staff, if we thought about this and say, well, if our kids are experiencing difficulties, maybe some of these areas, what are different accommodations or modifications that we could implement in our classroom so that we could proactively help students with some of these challenges. And then we know from the data that there's an overall impact on academic functioning, and there's studies that go back more than 20 years that show the longitudinal effects of trauma on students and therefore on their academic functioning. And we've seen decreases in reading ability and academic output. Students who had experienced trauma, unfortunately, had also had more suspensions and expulsions. And I would say that that is not a result of the children, but actually a result more of the school system, because suspensions and expulsions are adult behaviors, and we decide, we actually write the codes of conduct, so we can also look at how we can form more trauma-responsive codes of conduct and disciplinary policies. But across the board, we just know that the impact of trauma on kids is detrimental to academic success, having a lower GPA, having more days absent from school, decreased rates of high school graduation, and we, if we follow that trail down, we know how important these things are, and if you don't graduate from high school, what that can lead to. These are data from the ACES study. If we think back again to the different adverse events and the percent of students, this is the academic outcomes of chronic trauma. So what you're looking at on the y-axis going vertically are the percent of students with academic problems. Now on the x-axis going horizontally are the number of known adverse events. So you can see that as the number of adverse events increased, so too did the percent of students with academic problems. So for students with no known adverse events, there were 34% had academic problems, up to if you had 3 or more adverse events, 80% of those students experienced academic problems. And this is another chart that demonstrates the impact of academic outcomes of chronic trauma, which as your number of adverse childhood experiences increased, this is actually a little confusing, the not having a learning or behavior problem decreased. So it's just the inverse of that. And we also know from the ACES study, because it studied adults, so not just young people, but longitudinally, what are the impacts on adults who have experienced early adversity? And I think these are some pretty remarkable findings, which are that so many of these things can remain dormant and show up in ways in which we might not have thought. So this represents, if you experience an adverse childhood experience, what was the impact on you as an adult? And adults who experienced adverse childhood experiences were at greater risk for all of these different things that we see here. So things like injury, including traumatic brain injury, fractures and burns, mental health challenges, so higher impacts of depression, anxiety, suicide, and PTSD, maternal health, so greater risk for unintended pregnancy complications, and fetal death. People with higher adverse childhood experiences were at greater risk for infectious disease, so HIV and STDs, as well as chronic disease, such as cancer and diabetes. Additionally, people with adverse childhood experiences were more likely to engage in risky behaviors, both as young adults as well as in adults. So things like unsafe sex, alcohol and drug abuse, and they negatively impacted different opportunities in terms of education, occupation, and income. Again, these are the negative impacts and the lasting impacts, not just in the immediate, the things that happened to you as a child, seeing the longitudinal impact of the way that adverse childhood experiences impacted these children once they were adults. And I just want to pause and say that, again, this is the context of what we know about trauma going into COVID-19. Only from a logic model am I trying to extrapolate. I don't know, the impact of COVID-19 on students and the longitudinal effects of it, but I think we absolutely know that there is trauma associated with COVID-19, that it is serious, that it's far-reaching, and that we all need to, and we all want to better support kids so that we can respond to their trauma and to our own trauma. So as we wrap up here, talked about childhood exposure to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, some of the proximal outcomes, so what happens next. We know that there's poor academic performance, emotional difficulties and social impairments, and then the distal outcomes, so long-term, we know that there's chronic health problems, there's lower employment, and higher incarceration rates. Good thing is that we also know that when we have a trauma-responsive system and we respond to childhood exposure to adverse childhood experiences and trauma, there are skills and strategies and things that we can do that have been shown to be effective in improving social emotional wellness and well-being, improving student mental health, and improving academic achievement, which we know leads to better health outcomes, stable employment, and a lower incarceration rate. So this is sort of the preview for our Thursday webinar at 2 o'clock, which is, we look to, so what are the trauma responsive school strategies that we can implement so that we can counter and better support children who are experiencing trauma. And again, just to look at where we started, we went from realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma to recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. Our next step on Thursday is to respond by integrating trauma-informed principles and really to create a safe and nurturing school climate. And then the final piece of resisting the re-traumatization. And I want us to just go back and review a bit, which is that, when we talked about the trauma-informed system, some of the biggest shifts, and I want you to be able to think about, if this is the one webinar that you're able to make, what is one thing that you can do going forward? And we started off by saying that the trauma-informed system represents a shift in the philosophical position from viewing people as sick or bad to a system that honors and adapts to the experiences of the people it serves. And we can do this within our school, within our home, our agency, organization. And if we look down at the bottom of the screen here, one example of this shift can be a shift from asking students what's wrong with you, to asking students what has happened to you, what's going on in your life, so that I can know who you are, I can know what's happened to you, and I can respond in a responsive way, a trauma responsive way, if you have experienced trauma. And just to revisit, and the trauma-informed systems core values of everything starts with equity, inclusion, and cultural responsiveness and cultural humility. And we value that. It's a place of starting. We wouldn't be able to be truly trauma responsive if we didn't value those. And then what can we do to promote safety, both physical as well as social emotional? I'm joined by Kat. Hello. What can we do to promote trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment? I also want to revisit our self-care, because deserve the self-care, it's critically important in order for us to really respond to our students' trauma, to be able to support our colleagues and our staff and our family, that we focus on our own self-care and our ABCs of wellness around awareness, balance, and connection. And the C might also stand for cats in this case. And just to finally wrap up with a few of Governor Cuomo's suggestions of remember where we were and what we've accomplished. I think it's okay to say, I don't know. Please wear a mask when needed out in public and in social situations if you have to be in them, and to lead with love of ourselves, of each other, and that we are all in this together. Once again, we have our both New York State emotional support line that's open to everyone, as well as our National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that is available both in English and in Spanish. And again, if there's one thing that you can do, it's to share these with someone who you think might be struggling. There's always help, and anyone can always reach out. And again, I just want to frame this in terms of what's coming up for our schedule. And I apologize for cat crawling around the computer here. But this is part 1, Trauma 101. Part 2 of this series will be Skills and Strategies on Thursday, May 7th. And part 3, Trauma and MTSS on Thursday, May 14th. I also encourage you to join our School Clinicians Forum with Dr. Lopez. The next one is tomorrow, actually, at 2 o'clock. And if you have any questions, Louise Dutra's contact information is at the bottom right. You can put your email in the chat so that she has that. You can also email her at ldutra@pnwboces.org. So with that, I thank you all for joining today. I apologize that this is not more of an interactive format, but I'm happy to stick around after and we can chat for a bit. And I hope that you remain safe and well. And I thank you for all that you're doing and wish you a happy Teacher Appreciation Week. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.